The sound of a champagne cork is indistinguishable from a gunshot if the room is loud enough. Elara Voss had learned that in her first week at Meridian, the kind of restaurant where the wine list was thicker than a legal brief, and the clientele made the kind of decisions that moved cities. She had learned a great many things at Meridian. How to pour without being seen, how to refill a glass without interrupting a sentence, how to stand at the edge of a room and become, for all practical purposes, part of the wallpaper. It was a skill. She had never been given credit for it. Elara was 29 years old. She had a degree in accounting from the University of Illinois that no one had ever asked about. She was 5'3" and wore a size 18 uniform that the restaurant's general manager, a thin-lipped man named Barfield, had once referred to as a logistical challenge. She had smiled at him then, the way she smiled at a great many things that did not deserve a real response, and she had gone back to work. Meridian sat on the 42nd floor of the Ashton Tower in downtown Chicago. It had 2 Michelin stars, a 6-week reservation wait list, and, on the 3rd Thursday of every month, a private dining room in the back that was booked under a shell company called Atlas Holdings. The staff who worked those evenings signed additional NDAs. The tips were extraordinary. The questions were not encouraged. Elara worked those evenings. She had done the math, of course. She always did the math. The men who came through that private dining room were not businessmen in any traditional sense. Their drivers waited in the lower garage for 3, sometimes 4 hours. Their phones never rang because their phones were left at the door. They ate beautifully, spoke quietly, and watched each other the way wolves watched weather. She had never spoken to any of them directly. She refilled. She removed. She disappeared back through the service corridor before a thought could fully form. Until the night she noticed that something was wrong with the count. It started with a bread basket. She had been cycling through the room. A table of 7, the usual configuration, when she saw the man at the far end, the one they called Mr. Ashford in the reservation notes, pass something small and folded beneath his napkin to the man seated 2 chairs down. The motion was practiced. Almost invisible. Almost. Elara had been invisible longer than either of them had been careful. She kept moving. She removed an empty plate. She refilled a water glass without a drop on the linen, and in her peripheral vision, which she had honed over 5 years of working rooms, where the wrong kind of attention could cost a person something permanent, she counted. 7 chairs. 7 men. 8 glasses of water she had just filled. She stopped at the service corridor and counted again in her head. She was not wrong. She was never wrong about numbers. It was the one thing she had always been certain of, even when she was uncertain of everything else. There were 8 people in a room booked for 7. The 8th was behind the decorative partition on the east wall, the one that housed the auxiliary sound system no one had touched since the renovation. It was a tight space, just large enough for a person who was not trying to be comfortable. Only effective. Elara set her tray down on the service counter and looked at the partition for a long moment. Then she looked at the man at the head of the table. She knew his name, of course. Everyone who worked the 3rd Thursday knew his name, even if they never said it aloud, even if it appeared nowhere in the paperwork. Ronan Cade. The kind of name that moved money and men, and occasionally outcomes. He was 41 years old, and he sat at the head of every table in every room he walked into, not because he demanded it, but because the geometry of power arranged itself around him automatically, the way iron filings arrange themselves around a magnet. He had dark hair going silver at the temples, hands that were always still, and eyes the color of deep water, the kind that had no bottom you could see. In 5 years of working this room, he had never looked at her directly. She had never wanted him to. Attention, in her experience, was rarely a gift, but she was standing in the service corridor, with the weight of a secret that did not belong to her, and the seconds were moving. and the man behind the partition had not moved in 4 minutes, which meant he was waiting, not exploring. And the thing about people who wait is that they have already decided. Elara picked up a cocktail napkin and a pen from the service counter. She wrote quickly, in the block print she used for inventory notes, clean and certain. There is a man behind the partition on your east wall. He has been there at least 7 minutes. He is not staff. She folded the napkin once. She picked up the nearest decanter. The Barolo, which Mr. Cade had not yet had refilled, so there was legitimate reason to approach, and she walked back into the room. She moved the way she always moved, unhurried, expected. The specific practice non-presence of a woman who had been told, in 100 small ways, that she was not worth noticing. She reached his right side and began to pour. Her hand was not shaking. She was very proud of that. She set the napkin on the edge of the table as she would set a cocktail receipt. A natural motion, a reflex, and then she stepped back and turned and walked to the next table without looking at him. She did not go back to the service corridor. She went to the far corner of the room, near the secondary exit, and she pretended to check the alignment of the silverware on the empty prep station. And she waited. She heard the sound. Not a word, not a movement, but a shift. The specific quality of a room's silence changing. She had spent years learning to hear it. 3 seconds later, 2 of the men at the table stood, not urgently. With the deliberate calm of people who had rehearsed this, they moved toward the east partition. Elara did not watch. She kept her eyes on the silverware. The sound that came next was brief and muffled and not a champagne cork. The room did not erupt. The men at the table did not stand. Ronan Kay did not raise his voice. That was the thing about rooms like this. They had been engineered against disruption, and the people in them had been shaped by a world that rewarded composure above almost everything else. It was only later, after the private dining room had emptied with a quiet efficiency, that Elara did not witness directly, because she had been released early by Barfield, with a tip envelope so thick it did not fit neatly in her pocket, that she allowed herself to sit in her car in the lower garage and feel the full weight of what she had done. Her hands were shaking now. She had not known, when she picked up that pen, whether Ronan Cade would read the note and act, or whether he would fold it back into the napkin and have her escorted out before dessert. She had not known whether the man behind the partition was a threat, or a test, or something else entirely that she did not have the vocabulary for. What she had known was the math. 8 when there should have been 7. She had acted on the math. She always acted on the math. She drove home through the November rain and told no one. The call came 11 days later. She was at her kitchen table doing the books for her second job. She did freelance accounting for 3 small businesses on the weekends. Nothing glamorous. A dry cleaner and a florist, and a woman who sold artisanal hot sauce online. When her phone rang with a number she did not recognize, she almost didn't answer. She had a policy about numbers she didn't recognize. She answered, "Mrs. Voss." Not a question. A statement, delivered in a voice that was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that did not need to perform authority, because it had simply never been without it. She knew it immediately. She did not know how, except that certain things imprint without permission. "Yes," she said. Her voice was even. She had a policy about that, too. "You were working the 3rd Thursday dining room on the 14th. I was." A pause. Brief. "I'd like to speak with you." She thought about saying no. She thought about it carefully and genuinely, and for approximately 4 full seconds, which was 3 seconds longer than she usually needed. "All right," she said. He told her a time and a location. Not Meridian, somewhere else, somewhere quiet, and she wrote it down in the margin of the dry cleaner's quarterly report, because it was the only paper in front of her, and she looked at it after she hung up and thought, "This is a door." She had always been careful about doors. She went anyway. The place he named was a coffee shop in Lincoln Park, the kind that had been there since the 90s, and smelled of old wood and burnt sugar. He arrived after she did, which she thought might be intentional. The kind of move that said, "I respected your time," while simultaneously saying, "I wanted to see how you handle waiting." She had handled it by ordering a drip coffee and reading the financial news on her phone and not looking at the door. He sat across from her with no preamble. In the non-Michelin light of an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, Ronan Cade looked like a man who had been constructed for a different, harder world and had simply not bothered to adapt. His suit was dark and unremarkable. His watch was expensive and still. He set his hands on the table and looked at her with the same focused attention that she imagined he gave to everything. Direct, patient, devoid of performance. It occurred to her, in a distant and irrelevant way, that no one had ever looked at her quite like that. "You noticed something the rest of my people missed," he said. "I counted," she said. There were 8 glasses. Something shifted in his expression. Not softened, shifted, like a piece of machinery adjusting to a new load. "My security team swept that room twice. Your security team was looking for weapons and devices." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "I was looking at the number of water glasses I'd filled," he studied her. "You've been working that room for 5 years, almost 6, and you've never—" He stopped, approached a table outside of my duties. She met his eyes. "No. Why that night?" It was a fair question. She had asked it herself, in the car afterward, and several times since. "Because there were 8, she said. The math was wrong. When the math is wrong, something is wrong. That's not a complicated principle." "No," he said. "It isn't." He picked up his coffee, looked at it, set it down. The man behind the partition was carrying a recording device and a secondary item that my team is still working to fully identify. He was placed there by someone who had access to the reservation details for that evening. Ilara absorbed this. How many people had access? His eyes didn't move from her face. 4. Including the restaurant's general manager. She thought of Barfield, his thin lips and his comment about her uniform. "Barfield," she said. Not a question. Something in his expression shifted again. "You're quick. He's the only one who would need the money badly enough." His wife filed for divorce in September. He refinanced the condo in June. The math on that is also wrong, if you look at his salary. Ronan Cade was quiet for a moment, that stretched in a way she didn't entirely know how to categorize. "How do you know about his mortgage?" he said, and his voice was very careful. "I do the monthly inventory reconciliation for Meridian's back office," she said. "Barfield processes payroll. Last spring he started running it 2 days late, every month, which is a cash flow tell. I wasn't investigating him, I just noticed." He looked at her for a long time. Outside, a bus went by on Fullerton, and the windows shook very slightly. "What is your full name?" he said. "You called me by it 20 minutes ago." "Your full name?" he said again, "because I want to say it correctly." She looked at him. "Ilara Voss! Ilara!" He said it once, quietly, like a word he was learning the weight of. "I have a proposal for you." She said no. Not immediately. She was too careful for that, too deliberate to say anything before she had thought it through. She took the week. She did the math on Barfield on the 3rd Thursday room, on the life she had assembled in the apartment above the dry cleaner whose books she kept, the life that was small and very specifically hers. She said no. He asked her to reconsider. She said no again. He did not push. He did not threaten. He did not appear, as she had half expected, at the door of her apartment with the particular persuasion that men in his world sometimes employed. He simply sent a text to her phone, the number she had not given him because she had not needed to, that read, "The offer is open. The timeline is yours." She read it standing in her kitchen at 6:15 in the morning in her socks, and she felt something she did not have a word for. Not fear, not flattery, something more structural than either. Then she went to work. 3 weeks later, Barfield disappeared. Not violently, not publicly, just gone. A brief email to staff about a family matter, a temporary manager installed by corporate, a silence that was answered by no questions because the people who worked the third Thursday room had survived by not asking questions. Elara worked the next third Thursday, and the one after that, and the one after that. The room was the same. The men were the same. The partition had been removed and replaced with a floral arrangement that no one commented on. Ronan Cade sat at the head of the table. On the fourth Thursday after Barfield's disappearance, as Elara was refilling the water glasses. 7, always 7. She still counted, she became aware. In the specific way she became aware of things, that he was watching her. Not the way the other men in the room sometimes watched her, with the blunt inattention of people surveying furniture, with the focused, patient attention of a man who was not in the habit of looking at things, unless they merited looking at. She finished refilling the glasses and moved to the next table without acknowledging it. At the end of the evening, there was an envelope on the service counter. Her name was on it in handwriting she had only seen once before, on a proposal she had declined. Inside was a note. You noticed the wrong number of glasses. I've been unable to stop thinking about that for 2 months. I don't expect that to make sense to you. It barely makes sense to me, but I would like, if you're willing, to buy you a cup of coffee that has nothing to do with anything except coffee. R.C. She stood in the service corridor under the fluorescent lights with the note in her hands. She thought about the math, not Barfield's math, not the 8 glasses, but a different kind. The calculus of risk and return, of doors opened and closed, of what it meant to be noticed by someone who had spent a lifetime being the one who did the noticing. She put the note in her pocket. She texted him at 11:17 that night. Coffee, she wrote. But I'm choosing the place. The response came in under a minute. 3 words. Name the time. Chicago in January is not a romantic city. The wind off the lake is punishing and specific, the kind of cold that has an opinion. Elara met him at a diner on Wabash that had been there since 1962 and served breakfast at all hours and did not care who you were, which was something she valued more than ambiance. She told him that. He looked at the laminated menus and the coffee mugs with the city seal and said, I haven't been in a place like this in years. I know, she said. He looked at her. You don't go places where you can't control the room, she said. You haven't for a long time. You've probably forgotten what it feels like to sit at a table where no one is watching you. A pause, long. Are you always like this? Like what? Like someone who has been reading the room since before she walked in. She considered this. Yes, she said. Mostly because I learned early that rooms don't read back. It landed in the space between them, and he looked at her for a moment with something in his expression that was not the composed, machined attention she'd catalogued from across a dining room. It was something earlier than that, something that had not yet been refined into control. They do, he said, quietly. Sometimes. She wrapped her hands around her mug. The coffee was diner coffee, nothing special, which meant it was exactly what she'd wanted. He told her about the man behind the partition eventually. Not everything, but enough. The device had been a dual-function unit, recording and transmitting. The meeting had involved a discussion of a significant financial transition, the kind that, if heard by the wrong ears, would have moved certain pieces in ways that could not have been undone. The man had been contracted by a rival organization, and the chain of custody had led back through 2 intermediaries to a name that Ronan said quietly, and that she did not write down. Barfield gave them the access, she asked, for a number that cleared his divorce settlement and left him enough to relocate. She thought about Barfield, his precise, compensatory cruelty to people below him, the way he'd said logistical challenge with his eyes already moving away, like she was a problem to be routed around. Where is he now? Ronan picked up his coffee, somewhere warm. Something in his tone made her decide not to press it. They stayed for 2 hours. He paid, and she let him, because the fight was not worth having. and she was honest enough to admit that she was curious what a man like Ronan Cade was like when he wasn't being watched by everyone who owed him something. He was, as it turned out, a person, dry and careful with words, and quick in a way he mostly kept hidden. He asked about the accounting work. She told him about the florist and the hot sauce and the dry cleaner, and he listened to her talk about cash flow patterns in small businesses, with an attention so complete it was almost disorienting. "You're wasted," he said, not unkindly. "I'm comfortable," she said. "That's not the same thing." "I know," she said. "I chose it." He nodded. He did not argue. That was the first moment she decided, with any certainty, that she would see him again. She saw him again, and then again. The coffee shop on Wabash became a rotation. The diner, a tea house in Pilsen, once a late evening walk along the frozen lake shore, where they were both so cold by the end that she couldn't feel her fingers, and he held her hands between his without making anything of it, just warming them, efficient and certain, and said, "Next time you pick somewhere with heat. Next time," she said. And her voice did something it wasn't supposed to. She did not fall in love the way she'd been told love arrived, loudly, suddenly, like a collision. It came in arithmetic, one observation, then another. The way he remembered things she had mentioned once in passing, weeks later, without performing the memory. The way he stood when she entered a room, not because chivalry had been drilled into him, but because it was involuntary, like standing up when something important comes in. The way he looked at her, not past her or around her or through her, with the particular quality of attention that had been the rarest thing in her world since she was old enough to understand what it meant to be overlooked. She was not naive. She understood his world. She had been on the edges of it for 6 years, refilling glasses, watching men make decisions that ended things. She knew what he was, and she knew what it cost, and she understood that knowing was not the same as being prepared. But she had always acted on the math, and the math, when she ran it honestly, came out the same every time. He was the first person in her adult life who had looked at the number of glasses she'd filled and understood why it mattered. It was March when she finally accepted his original proposal. Not to work for him, not exactly, but an arrangement that was more specific than that. She would review the financial architecture of his operations with the same attention she gave to cash flow patterns in small businesses, which was to say, absolute, unhurried, honest. She told him her rate. He didn't negotiate. She started the following Monday. The office was not what she'd expected, not the wood-paneled, scotch and shadows aesthetic she might have imagined. It was functional, efficient. There were 3 other people who worked in the financial division, and they had been told, in whatever language such things were communicated, that Elara Voss was not to be questioned or condescended to, or given any version of the look that Barfield had given her about the uniform. She knew this because no one did any of those things. In 6 weeks she found 4 irregularities that the previous system had missed. 2 were incidental. 1 was structural. 1 was not. The 4th was a fractional diversion, small amounts, carefully timed, routed through a legitimate-looking expense category that had been established 14 months earlier by someone with access to the primary ledgers. The amounts were modest by any reasonable standard. Over 14 months, they came to just over $380,000. She brought it to Ronan on a Wednesday afternoon, in a single printed sheet, the way she brought everything, clean, numbered, annotated. He read it once. He set it down. He looked at the name she had circled at the bottom. "You're certain?" he said. "Not a question." "The pattern is not ambiguous," she said. "I triple-checked." He nodded slowly, and she watched something move across his face. Not surprise, which was telling. Something older. Something that looked, if she read it correctly, like grief processed through a very controlled filter. "How long have you known him?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. 18 years. She said nothing. She did not offer comfort she wasn't equipped to give, and she did not fill the silence with performance. She simply sat across from him and let the weight of it exist, which was, as it turned out, exactly the right thing to do. After a while, he said, "You know, you could have been very easy to overlook." "I know," she said. "I've been thinking about that. The fact that everyone did. It was useful," she said, "for a long time." "Not anymore," he said, and his voice was level and very certain. "Not while I'm in the room." She looked at him. The afternoon light came through the narrow window and caught the grey at his temples, and she thought about everything she had been before this. The invisible woman with the accounting degree, and the logistical challenge uniform, and the life assembled around the principle of being small enough not to bother anyone. And she thought about what the math said now, when she ran it. "That's a significant promise," she said. "I don't make the other kind," he said. She believed him. She was not certain she could have explained why to anyone who had not spent 6 years learning to hear the difference between a room that was safe and a room that was about to change. But she had. In April, she gave Barfield's old job to someone who deserved it. In May, she renegotiated the financial architecture of 3 subsidiary accounts in a way that corrected the structural irregularity she'd found, saved a significant and recurring expense, and solved a problem that had apparently been irritating 2 of Ronan's senior people for the better part of a year. They were not effusive about this. They were simply, for the first time, not dismissive. She understood that was its own language. In June, at a private dinner, not the 3rd Thursday room, somewhere quieter and smaller, somewhere that had been chosen because she would find it comfortable and not because it needed to impress anyone. Ronan Cade put his hand over hers on the table in the middle of a conversation about nothing particular and said, "I want to be clear with you about something." "You usually are," she said. "I need you to know that this," he looked at their hands, then at her, "is not connected to the work. It never was. The work came from what you did with the glasses. This is something else." She thought about the note in her pocket, 11:17 at night, name the time. She thought about hands warmed over the frozen lakeshore. She thought about the way he had said her name that first afternoon in the coffee shop, like he was learning the weight of it. "I know," she said. He nodded. He did not ask for anything else right then. He didn't need to. She turned her hand over, under his, and the city went on outside, loud and indifferent, the way it always had. Alara Voss had spent the better part of a decade making herself invisible, learning to pour without being seen, to count without being noticed, to understand rooms she was never meant to be remembered in. She was done with that now. She had come to understand exactly where the math had always been pointing. She simply hadn't been ready, until recently, to follow it all the way to the end.